Today, as we go through our reading of the Hebrew Bible, we're going to hear a story about the Israelites wandering through some of those geographical areas we mentioned on their way from Egypt through the Saudi Arabian Peninsula up to Israel, the Promised Land. And they encountered a lot of difficulty, as you may know, wandering through the wilderness, not having enough to eat. I was thinking about not having enough to eat and my experiences traveling to Malawi, and I thought it would be appropriate to share on World Communion Sunday and also to sort of whet your appetite for our AIM presentation next week. One of the first things that we did when we got there was to go to visit a couple of different families. And I remember Karina and I got to visit a woman, and she was at the lowest level of poverty. We call that level 1. And we met her and we learned about her family, and we just asked curious questions. I said, so, how are things going? And she said, well, not good. My son isn't here to help. I'm raising grandchildren by myself, and the harvest hasn't been very good this year. I said, oh, so how are your food stores? Do you have enough to eat? And she said, well, we actually ran out of food yesterday, so we're probably not going to eat tonight. And we'll try to pick up some piecework, and then we'll maybe get some food tomorrow. And very fortunately, one of the things that we brought with us as a gift to say thank you for letting us speak with you was like 25 pounds of maize meal. So we were able to give her something to eat for that very night. And it was amazing because if I had been in that situation, I would have been panicking. I've never been in that situation. I don't think many of us have been in the situation where we literally cannot get our hands on food for tonight and don't know where we're going to do it for tomorrow either. It's a rare occurrence in this country. But this woman, instead of panicking, just said, I'm sure we'll find something. I'm sure we'll get some work. I'm sure we'll figure something out. We've been through hard times before. That's okay. The level of trust that she had, that God would provide, even in those circumstances, was incredible. Later, we also met a woman who was doing much better and had received a grant that gave her a sewing machine. And she learned how to sew, and she started making, cloth and things, repairing clothing, and was making some good money for herself. And what she decided to do with her time, instead of spending more time making more clothes to sell, she started volunteering her time to teach other people to sew so that they too could have money. And I don't know about you, but I don't think about being in a situation where I, finally have enough that I'm not wondering where my next meal is coming from, and then thinking, what I need to do is volunteer my time. I would think, okay, I got to get ahead. I got to put something aside, but not this woman. It reminded me of the story of the widow's mite in the New Testament that Jesus tells, the woman who put in her last 2 copper coins and trusted that God would provide beyond that. So, in that context of stories of poverty and want and need like that, I'd now like to read to you our scripture lesson for today, which is Exodus chapter 16. This happens after the Israelites escaped from slavery in Egypt. The 10 plagues happened. They crossed the Red Sea, and here they are out in the desert. And it says, the whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you should complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he's heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat. In the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." And in the evening quails came up and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp, and when the dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" Manna. For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, they gathered it, as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So this is a great story. Story of manna in the wilderness, manna from heaven. It's a story that comes out of this situation of extreme hunger, extreme poverty. I don't know where my next meal is coming from. And that can make you behave very differently. I mean, this is hangry at a whole different level, right? This is real. This is very real. The Israelites, like most people, like that woman in Malawi, either of those women in Malawi, the Israelites did not enjoy poverty. They did not enjoy hunger. And they were willing to go back to Egypt and die rather than experience hunger. Can you imagine that? Being willing to go to a land that you know is hostile, a land that you know will kill you, because you'd just rather not go hungry. I was talking about this with some folks this morning, and the complaint there is just incredible. If only we had died in Egypt where we could eat bread. I was just thinking, you can't really eat bread if you've died. Must have been really bad out there in the wilderness. So they didn't like it. They were willing to give up everything for security, for some wheat, for some meat. This story represents maybe not the origin, but maybe the focus point of the concept of Egypt being a metaphor for self-reliance. Egypt was a place that was rich, that was wealthy. Egypt could do everything that it needed. It had its own security. It had its own food and water, its own military, its own housing. Everything was great in Egypt. They didn't need God, not like out in the wilderness. Egypt meant independence from God. Egypt meant reliance on the empire. Egypt meant going back into slavery. And you'll still hear preachers and rabbis talk about Egypt as a metaphor for slavery and self-reliance and independence from God. And when I think about it, it's such a powerful metaphor because each of us, I think, would probably really want to make the same kinds of decisions. We would really want to be able to rely on ourselves, be able to rely on Egypt. And I think about the folks in Malawi, they would absolutely love to rely on Egypt in many ways. Sometimes it might be literally, love to have foreign aid from Egypt, but would love to have something that provided them some semblance of security, knowing what's coming next, some independence from poverty. Egypt is what Jesus was thinking about when he was doing his ministry. He did talk a number of times about reliance on Egypt. He told this parable in Luke chapter 12 where there was a rich man, a rich fool, who had a harvest, and it was abundant and plentiful, and there was so much grain that there was no more room to store it in the storehouses. So he thought, I'm going to build more storehouses and store more grain. And then, of course, this is where we get, there's a wonderful little quote from the Bible that I'm sure you have pasted on your wall somewhere. "You fool, don't you know that this very night your life will be required of you?" And he dies, and what good did all of that grain do him? Rely, Jesus says, not on what you can provide for yourself, but on God. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? So, what is this story trying to teach us in all of this context about what Egypt means and what manna means and what the wilderness means? Well, I think we got to, parse things out pretty carefully. Because the plain reading of this story of manna, knowing all that context, is that savings accounts are sinful. If you've got extra money, why are you, putting it aside? You could be sharing that with your neighbor. So I hope none of you have a bank account, right? I'm assuming. And you all are going to go out, work tomorrow, get paid, and that'll provide your meal for the next day, right? Because you're sharing every little bit of excess. So obviously that's ridiculous, right? I don't think that's the reading. We've got to understand a little bit more that's going on here. Because, it's interesting. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us today our daily bread," right? But we actually really would hope for a week's worth, especially if you only pray it on Sundays. And it was interesting, when we were in Malawi, learned about how they say the Lord's Prayer, and some of the wording is a little bit different. And one of the things that caught me was they don't say, "Give us this day our daily bread." They say, "Give us food for this day." Give us food for the day. We'll worry about tomorrow when it gets to tomorrow. Whew. So this is an indictment for all of us with savings accounts. This is an indictment for all of us with retirement plans. It's a big indictment for Elon Musk, who I guess just made it to $500 billion. Woof, I got a long way to go. And by the way, I did some math on that. That's enough money if he sold all of his stock to fund the entire government of Malawi for 100 years, just all by himself. That would end poverty, I think, pretty quickly. But it's more than that, isn't it? If we take the plain reading of this story, that ridiculous reading, it's also an indictment for anybody who has a refrigerator. You saving food for tomorrow? Why? Won't God provide? Don't we trust God to provide food for the day and then food for tomorrow? The Israelites did, after all. So this isn't about that, though, right? It's not about whether we have a refrigerator or savings accounts or $500 billion. It's instead about trust. It's instead about who do we rely on? Where do we place our hearts? Where is our real treasure? There's a great story about Kurt Vonnegut, the author, who was at a party at one of his friends' houses, who, just happened to be a billionaire. We all have those friends. And he was talking with another one of his friends, and they're looking around the rooms together, and his friend turns to him and says, "Does it bother you that yesterday our host made as much money as you made in selling all of your copies of the novel Catch-22?" And Kurt Vonnegut looks at this guy, and supposedly he says, "You know what? It doesn't bother me because I have something that he doesn't. I have enough." And I think that's what this story is driving at. What do we mean when we say we have enough? For the Israelites in the wilderness, enough was a day's worth of food. For Elon Musk, maybe enough is $500 billion. We'll see. For women in Malawi, is enough to have a sewing machine? Is enough to have half a bag of grain? What does enough look like? And even then, I think we're asking the wrong kind of question. Because I think this story is really trying to teach us something spiritual as well. What does it mean to have enough spiritually? The spiritual needs that we have are probably just about as important as the physical needs, right? We've got to make sure that we survive the day. And we've got to make sure that our souls are fed. But the difference between the two is that the spiritual needs are eternal ones, and the physical needs are a little more temporary. And I think you just ask any Holocaust survivor about which needs are more important, the spiritual or the physical. It's the spiritual that gets you through. Manna in the wilderness is the story of God providing for spiritual and physical needs at the same time. These Israelites, they had just witnessed all kinds of miracles. They just crossed the Red Sea. They had seen the 10 plagues, and they sang songs of victory before God, and then they started to get worried just like that. And God doesn't respond to their complaining by disciplining them. The first thing God does upon hearing the complaint is to provide manna. The first thing God does is to say, I hear you. I hear your suffering. I hear your complaining. You can rely on me. God provided them with a very clear lesson. You can trust me to provide every single day. And that's going to color how you have your relationship with me now and in the 40 years to come and in the generations upon generations to come. Manna was about teaching the Israelites and teaching us that it is possible to trust God and that life gets better when you do. To know that God will sustain us, to trust that God can sustain us through starvation, through thirst, through grief, through fear, through anxiety, through dread, through anything life can throw at us, through death itself. We can trust in God. Even when we're out in the wilderness with nothing in front of us, God provides. And you know what? Maybe God won't provide enough for you to survive. Maybe God won't provide enough that you can avoid death. Sometimes that happens. But God is able to be trusted even in those circumstances. And so we find that in every circumstance, if we have God, we have enough. I guarantee that all of us in this room have enough when it comes to physical things. And what I mean by that is not enough to avoid poverty, not enough to avoid difficulty, not enough to get all the best medical care in the world, but enough to know that God provides for us and for people all around the world. The question is, can you trust in that? Can you trust in God in every circumstance? What does that look like for you? To trust in God when you're heading into some maybe challenging times, some uncertainty, you're heading into some anxiety-provoking situations. You know, the Sunday scaries are always just around the corner. What does it mean to trust in God? What does it mean to gather that trust up like manna that appears every morning with the dew? I hope that you find a way each and every day to grow that trust, to exercise it, to see what God will do with you and in you if you let him.